kidney history. All right, Jervosai, good morning. Let us begin. A good morning. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. First of all, a Baruch haba to Howard Goldstein. Baruch haba, Howard. Welcome back. Welcome back. I mean, not welcome back to this year. He's been this year the entire time. Welcome back into this year, into the inside. Welcome back. Wonderful to see you. All right, Jervosai, we'll begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, to thank Czinn Teri Kahn Czinn for dedicating the Shimmy Batsheva this month in gratitude to Hashem and welcoming their first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, to Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Zechariah for immense debt of gratitude to those who make the shiurim available beyond the confines of the Beis Midrash, specifically Moishe Abramson and Jeremy Lasson, Shimmy Batsheva Messing, in honor of the Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah, and Paul and Kathy Pollack, dedicating the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah bas Avrohom, and great-grandmother Tziril bas Rav Dov. Our week of learning sponsor, Neil and Pam Weissman, for dedicating the shiurim this week in memory of Pam's father, Achazin Yisrael Zundel ben Yehuda Leib, and our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Rebecca Chesner, in memory of her father, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Meir, on the occasion of his first yard site. We hope that in the merit of all of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, and the Meir Hashem, those celebrating Simchas, should the Meir Hashem continue to have many more in the years to come. And I will say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Yud 10. We're actually picking up in Meir Hashem at the halacha, at the beginning of the new parak, bottom of Testament Beis 9b at the Mishnah, fourth parak of Shekalim. So we'll say a very interesting Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Truma mahayu osinba. What did they do with the truma? Now we'll say, remember what the Gemara is asking over here is as follows. That remember we've spoken about so far the fact that they are going ahead and making 3 withdrawals at 3 different times of the year, right? Remember again, 3 is the number to remember. Three utensils, 3 kupos, 3 boxes that each hold 3 sa'ah, 3 withdrawals throughout the year. And although we saw there's a machlokes on the timing of the withdrawals, everyone's agreeing pretty much on the mechanics of the withdrawals. Now it goes to the shaila is, what did we use the money for? What was the money used for? Good. So the Gemara Mishnah says as follows. Avram, this is like a good internal controls Gemara, right? There we go. Like we need our filings. So again, if you're going to withdraw money, again, I will say in general, we've seen before we did this sugi that when it comes to communal money, how careful we have to be. So a Mishnah like this is incredibly important because as much as hopefully you want to trust the people in charge, remember I will say the guiding principle in all of this has been the Yisem Nikiyim. In other words, don't rely on people to trust you. In other words, I will say the goal is to structure things in such a way where trust essentially is not necessary, right? If there's transparency and there's disclosure, I don't have to trust anyone. Of course, I trust everyone, but I don't have to rely on trust because everything is spelled out. So it says the Mishnah, Truma mahayu osim. What do they do with it? So lochin bat midin musafin uviniskehem. So we go ahead and we buy Tamidin, right, the carbon tamid, the daily communal offerings, musaf offerings. Niskeim refers to the wine libations, which accompanies the karbanos. Ha'omer ushtei halechem. This is very, very lemaisa sugyas. The karban ha'omer, right? The barley offering. Shtei halechem are the 2 loaves of shavuos. Velechem aponim. And the money withdrawn was used for the weekly lechem aponim, showbread. V'chol karbanos ha'tzibur. And ultimately, again, any communal offerings. So pretty much that list over here, Tamidin, Musafin, Nisachim, Omer, Shtei halechem, lechem aponim. These are all communal offerings that are brought from the withdrawals. Very interesting. Shomrei Svichen b'Shvius, Loten Scharan mitrumas halishkan. So we'll say this is really quite fascinating. Now remember, on the year after the Shemitah year, or really the year of Shemitah year, so you need to bring a karban ha'omer and you need to bring shtei halechem. The problem is, of course, that all produce is hefker. So interestingly enough, if you take a look at the Tiklin Chadatin for just a moment, he says, Svichin, is 3 lines out from the bottom. Ha'olin me'elehen mimashinish shenishru bekatzir, v'nosnu schar l'shomer sheyim neragavim. I'm supposed to now listen to this. You see, in the actual Shemitah year itself, the produce that you're reaping was often planted beforehand, right? It was planted before the Shemitah year. What about the year after the Shemitah year? So we'll say, so often when grain was growing, it grew based on what's called tzvichen. Tzvichen means that whenever you end up harvesting something, some of the seeds end up coming off, fall into the ground, and kind of grow on their own. So you would bring omer and shtei alechem from tzvichen. Now the interesting part is everything is hefker. So because everything is hefker, what they used to do is if they saw barley or wheat growing, they would kind of cordon off a particular area in order to go ahead and reserve that for Omer and Shtei Alechem. The issue is everything is hefker. So technically speaking, anyone could take it. So you couldn't actually technically stop someone from taking it, except that they would have a guy positioned there and he would say, listen, you can take it if you want to, but we're trying to utilize this ultimately for the Beis HaMikdash. So that's, again, if you take a look at that Tiklin Chadatin, he says, one more time, he says, Ha'olin me'elehen, this refers to growth which occurs by itself. Shenishru b'katzir, the seeds fell off when the previous crop was being harvested. The nasnu schar l'shomer, sheyimna ragli behemos misham, shetzrichen la'omer beis, shetzrichen la'omer ubeis halechem shenamban ela min ha'chodosh, Umina Aretz, Eretz Yisrael, Fisha Tzarech Karban, Hinu Ke Karban Dami, Lachin Nasnu Scharim Shmas Lishka. So interesting. So Tiklin Chadatin actually brings down. He doesn't bring down as much to keep people away, but he says much more to keep animals away. So what they would do is they would hire someone and they would pay someone to kind of just stand guard by the wheat so that they would have barley and wheat available for the Omer and Shtei Halechem. Then I will say, interestingly enough, since this individual was protecting wheat and barley for sacrificial purposes, his avoda was sacrificial in nature, and therefore they paid his salary from the withdrawals. What we're going to see, by the way, is not only was the withdrawal from the truma, what they call the truma, not only was the withdrawal for actual sacrificial items, but we'll call it support activities as well, which makes sense. Support activities as well were paid from the Trumas Halishka as well. Listen to this. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Aparotze Misnadev Shomer Chinam. So I'll say this is very interesting. Rabbi Yossi says, by the way, if somebody wants to volunteer his services and be an unpaid custodian, we accept that too. So I'll say, interestingly enough, there's a little bit of machlokes in the Mishnah over here. Does the person who's watching over the grain and the barley have to be paid? Or can he choose to volunteer his services? If you take a look one more time at the Tiklin Chadatin, he writes over Shomer Chinam, V'af shekana osam in a hefker, kisha shomer chinam, savar de carbon yachim mishnan. So we're going to see something very interesting. The first being the Tanakama does not want unpaid custodians. We want to pay someone to watch the wheat and the barley. Why do you want to pay someone? Right, so first of all, I'll say, so in general, right, so Klal Gadol, it's interesting. It's always business people who give this answer, right? So, right, of course you want to pay someone because you get what you pay for. So if somebody's doing you a favor, what's going to happen? One day he's too tired or whatever else, you pay someone. Interestingly enough, there's another issue over here. The other issue over here is if somebody's getting paid by the Mikdash, they're on the Beis HaMikdash's time, which means that it's clear that what they're doing for the Beis HaMikdash. The concern with a volunteer, we'll say, is what could happen? Technically speaking, the guy who's a volunteer could acquire the wheat and the barley for himself, because after all, this is hefker. This is all hefker, right? So he can acquire it for himself. Now, if he acquires it for himself, the shaila then becomes, could his wheat then be transformed into Beis HaMikdash wheat or Beis HaMikdash barley? We're going to see this is actually a point of contention. So the Tanakama says, we want to pay someone. We want to pay someone. We don't want any favors over here. Rabbi Yossi says no. He could be a shomer chinam, and it's not a problem. Even if he acquires the wheat or the barley, subsequently he could transfer that ownership to the Beis HaMikdash, and it becomes Beis HaMikdash wheat and barley that could be used for kavanah omer and shtei alechem. So the Gemara says as follows: Amru lo af ato omer kein shein ba'in ella mishal tzibor. So ultimately, again, the Rabbanon said back to Rabbi Yossi, they said again, just understand, at the end of the day, the wheat and the barley used for karban omer and shtei alechem must belong to the community, cannot belong to an individual. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi's entire approach is predicated on the idea that that which belongs to the individual can be transferred and given over to the Beis HaMikdash. Now we'll say, remember, that's not a chiddush. Of course, we know something individually owned can be given over to the Beis HaMikdash. Remember, the difference over here is that generally by karban ha'omer, as well as by shtei halechem, the wheat begins in the ownership of the Beis HaMikdash. Here, there's a little bit of an additional step. The concern is the wheat may be owned by an individual. When I say wheat, I'm including the wheat and the barley. May be owned by an individual, subsequently transferred. Does that work or not? Rabbi Yossi clearly indicates that it does. Let's see. Top of Yud, Rabosai. So Ma'ra'ah. So we'll say now this notion, the Gemara is going to focus on this notion that something owned by an individual can in fact be transferred over to the Mikdash. So it's actually quite interesting. So ma ra'az man atse kohanim ba'am lihimano. So we'll say the Gemara over here quotes a Gemara actually Maseches Tainis. Remember Maseches Tainis that talks about the fact that there were 9 different dates in which wood was brought to the Beis HaMikdash, and ultimately, again, those 9 dates were each celebrated as Yomim Tovim. So watch this. When Klal Yisrael came back with Ezra, and ultimately there was not enough wood in the chamber. And I also remember again, if there's one thing you need a significant commodity of in the Beis HaMikdash, it is wood. Because you also remember again, you can't operate the altars without wood, right? Remember again, even the internal altar, right, which was the Mizbeach HaPanimi, the incense altar. So remember again, you didn't burn logs, but you burned coals. But what kind of coals? Coals that came from wood. So when they came back, so they did not go ahead and have enough wood. Ultimately, again, these families, so you remember Maseches Tainis identifies the families. These families went ahead and pledged wood to the Beis HaMikdash. Umasrum l'tzibor. The Rabbi said, now remember again, this was privately owned wood that they then conferred ownership over to the Beis HaMikdash. The karva mehen karbanos sibor. And ultimately, again, they went ahead and they used it afterwards for karbanos sibor, for communal offerings. V'hisnu imoim neviim shebenehem, shafilu lishka malaya eitzim, va'amdu elu v'nisnadvu eitzim mishal atzmon, shelo yehe karban miskarev ela mishalah and tchila. And I will say this is actually quite beautiful. The Nevi'im, the prophets of that time, instituted the following idea, which is that whenever these families want to donate wood, even if the storehouses of the Beis HaMikdash are full, if these families donate, not only do we accept their donation, but their wood is used. Their wood is used. So we'll say this was a sign of Hakaras Hatov. These families stepped up at a time that no one else was stepping up. So the Nevi'im said, even if the storehouse is fully stocked, if these individuals come forward and donate wood, we not only accept it, but we use it first on the Mizbeach. So we'll say, so again, the point over here was, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see from here that even privately owned property could be transferred over to become publicly held property. See, remember again, there are certain things that have to belong to the tzibur in order for them to be effective. One of those things is wood, right? Wood used on the Mizbech, because wood, remember wood, as we're going to see, essentially has the status of like a carbon. So karbanos tzibur must belong to the tzibur. So what you see over here is that even something which begins in the possession of an individual can be transferred, effectively transferred over to the tzibur. So the Gemara says, Am Rabbi Acha to Rabbi Yossi. This is Rabbi Yosa. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yosa. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosa Amar Af Harotze Misnadei Shomechinim. Because we'll say Rabbi Yosa that they're quoting over here is Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah. This is Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah who said that even if an unpaid custodian wants to watch over the svichin, the growths in the Shemitah year of the barley, of the wheat, he can do so. And we're not concerned that he's going to acquire the wheat and the barley, because technically, even if he does acquire the wheat and the barley, then what? It's okay. He could just transfer ownership over it to the Beis HaMikdash. So I will say, this is the same idea. These families pledged wood. It was their wood. But they clearly conveyed ownership over the wood to the Beis HaMikdash, showing us that even privately owned property can be transferred over to the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yossi, B'shin Rabbi Ilah, Divrei Akolhi. Others say no, this can actually be reflective of the view of everyone. Because the Gemara says why? Ma paligon begufo shel karban. Because the only machlokes Rabbi say ultimately again is the actual carbon itself. Could an animal, right? Could a carbon owned by an individual ultimately again be transferred over to the tzibur and serve as a carbon tzibur. Aval b'machshiri carbon, what we call machshirin. So machshirin are the supplemental items associated with karbanos, like wood, right? Ultimately again, kol amma modi shemishtana carbon yakal, the carbon tzibur. So you will say it could very well be that the machlokes is only by a carbon itself. But by machshiri ha-carbon, right, by we'll call it carbonic accessories, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, it can be transferred from the individual ultimately to the collective. Tani, isha sha'asasa kisonos libna. Well, this is an interesting case. Let's say you have a mother who made a kisonos. We'll say kisonos literally means a tunic. Her son's a Kohen. Tiklin Chadatim brings it down that it's a Kohen Gadol, but I don't know that it matters if it's a Kohen Gadol or regular Kohen. The point over here is a mother made a tunic, a kisones for her son. So she made one of the big day kahuna for her son. What's the halacha? Ksheira. The halacha is it works. Now we'll say, however, ubilvad shetim serena letzibor. As long as what? As long as she conveys ownership of that cloak to the tzibur. In other words, the big day kahuna must belong to the tzibur. So we'll say, so again, what do you see from here? That personally owned property can be conferred. Now I will say, again, I want to be clear. You might be thinking to yourself, of course personally owned property can be conveyed to the tzibur, right? Every single time I offer up a carbon, am I not donating something to the Beis Midrash? But remember again, this is very different over here. There are certain things that are karbanos tzibur, that have to belong to the tzibur. So generally the way that would work is the tzibur would purchase it. So the shayla the Gemara is dealing with over here is, could individually owned property be conveyed over and become communally owned property? So the Gemara says over here, you see the mother could make her Kohen son a kisones. And again, the Gemara says it works, as long as what? As long as she conveys ownership. Same thing that we saw before. These individuals pledged wood, privately owned wood, became communally owned wood. Rabbi Achad, Rabbi Yossi, this must reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah. Because we also remember again, all roads lead back to the Mishnah. What did Rabbi Yossi say in the Mishnah? When we have a Shemitah year and somebody's got to watch over some grain and some barley that the animals don't trample on it, in order that we have barley and wheat for the Omer and Shtei Alechem. Rabbi Yossi says, you don't have to pay the guy, right? The Tanna Kama says, pay him, right? We'll say, why do you want to pay him? Because if you pay him, he's on the Beis Hamikdash's clock, which means he cannot acquire that wheat and that barley for himself. Rabbi Yossi says, don't worry about it. What's the worst case scenario? Even if he acquires it for himself, not a problem. He'll just what? Convey ownership of it over to the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, this case of the mother who could make the tunic for her son, for her Kohen's son, is also Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer Afrotzim is not Dev Shomer Chinam. Rabbi Asi or Rabbi Yossi B'Shem Rabbi Lilah Amar no Divrei Akolhi Ma Pligon Begufo Shel Carbon Ava B'Machshirei Carbon Kol Ama Modi Shu Mishtane Carbon Yachad the Carbon Tzibur. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, quotes Rabbi Yossi named Rabbi Lilah, who says the only machlokes Rabbosai is with the Gufo Shel Carbon. The only machlokes is with an actual carbon itself. But Machshirei Carbon, what we call accessory items, everyone agrees that what? That halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and switch an item over from personally owned to communally owned. And therefore, Rabbi said the case of the tunic would be the same thing as the wood, which are items that are accessories. So Rabbi say, so it comes out over here that the machlokus really only comes up with an actual carbon itself, which Rabbi say that's really the case of the Mishnah, right? The case of the Mishnah is really dealing mamish with the carbon. In this case, the carbon is the wheat, the carbon is the barley. But with accessories, everyone seems to be totally comfortable with the idea that you could take privately owned property and convert it into publicly owned property. So the Gemara says, Mas Nisan Pliga Rabbi Yossi. So we have a Mishnah that argues on Rabbi Yossi. Because what does the Mishnah say? Osan hayamim noagin b'shas carbon v'shalo b'shas carbon. So we'll say it's very interesting. Those days, because going back to the Mishnah in Tainis. So we'll say, so remember again, those days is a reference to the fact that, remember again, these 9 dates, these 9 families who pledged wood to the Beis HaMikdash, whenever they brought their carbon, it was a yomtiv for them. It was a yomtiv, a personal yomtiv. Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara explains that they conducted themselves, these dates were Yamim Tovim, even when the Beis HaMikdash no longer stood. even when the Beis Midrash no longer stood and they were no longer bringing the wood, they still treated it as a Yom Tiv. Rabbi Yossi says no. Eino noegin ela b'shas karban bilvad. Rabbi Yossi says not true. They only celebrated these days as a Yom Tiv when they actually had the opportunity to bring the wood. Now, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is inferring is as follows: the fact that these families who pledged wood treated the day that they brought the wood like a Yom Tiv, and they treated it like a Yom Tiv even when after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed and they were no longer bringing it, indicates to us that they did not look at the wood as machshirin, but they looked at the wood as what? A karban itself. They viewed the wood as a karban. And the fact that, again, the rabbis were okay with letting them conduct themselves like a Yom Tiv indicates to us that they viewed the wood like a karban. Remember again, what was the distinction we're making the whole time? The distinction we're making the whole time is all of these cases of wood and the tunic, these are all cases of what? Machshirin, accessories. And everyone agrees that by accessories, you can go in and transform private property into public property. But with the karban itself, that's a machlokes. But you see from here that they were treating the wood like a karban. And yet the rabbis were totally okay with letting privately owned wood become communally owned wood. If the wood is treated like a karban, that teaches us that even by karbanos, privately owned items can be transformed into publicly held items. To which the Gemara says, Va'od min hadad, the Sefer Bos, listen to this. Rabbi Silber, just to show you how far the Yom Tov identity of these days went. Listen to this. Rabbi Tzadok, Anu Hayinu mibnei Sana ben Binyamin. We are descendants of the family of Sana ben Binyamin. This is one of the families who pledged the wood. So listen to this. V'chal Tisha B'av lios b'Shabbos. 1 year Tisha B'av fell out on Shabbos. V'dachinu oso l'matzei Shabbos. And of course, when Tisha B'av falls out on Shabbos, what happens? It's pushed to the 10th of Av. The Rabbosai, the family of Sana ben Binyamin, what was the day they donated wood? Their day was the 10th of Av. So it turned out now that the observance of Tisha B'av fell out on their Yom Tiv. Watch this. V'hainu mis'an v'lo mashlimin. And we started the fast, but we did not complete the fast. Only fasted half a day. So I will say, so what does this show you? What this shows you is that, first of all, again, obviously they were not treating the donation of wood just like the donation of machshirin. They were treating the donation of wood like what? Like a karban. And that's why it became a dramatic Yom Tov for them, to the point I was saying, this is incredible. We'll say, this, by the way, this is people telling you what they did. The day that we donated wood was a Yom Tov because it was a karban. And therefore, when Tisha B'av was a nitcha and fell out on our Yom Tov, we fasted half a day. And I will say, the fact that it's included in the Gemara seems to indicate to us what? That nobody had a problem with that, right? The Rabbanim did not have a problem with that, which shows you, so again, therefore, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, you see a case of a karban. One could go ahead and transform privately held karbanos or privately held item into a communally held karban. Quite dramatic. So I'll say, the Gemara goes weiter. So I'll just point out, all right, so I'll just show you, what about this machlokes over here? So I'll say, so what do we do again? Specifically, we pointed out over here that what happens in the Shemitah year with the Omer and Shtei Alechem. Well, this is very important. So halacha l'maisa, do we pay someone or not pay someone, right? So we'll say, remember, so listen to this. So the Rambam says, Bishnas Hashmita, this is in Perek Dalet in Hilchos Shekalim. Perek Dalet Halacha Hey. Bishnas Hashmita, she hefker, sochrin based in Shomrim, shishmur miktas vichen, shet samchu, kidei she'aviu mena omer shtei alechem, shein baim ela min achadash, ve'ela Shomrim, notlin scharan mitrumas lishkas. First of all, the Rambam paskins, that again, during the Shemitah year, where you need wheat and you need barley, we hire someone to stand guard over some wheat and some barley to keep the animals from trampling on it, and we pay his salary from the machzis hashakel. So the Rambam next halacha says, what happens if somebody wants to donate their services? Misha misnadev lishmar bechinam ein shomin lo. We'll say again, incredible. Somebody wants to donate his services, you say no. No, not. We're happy to take his services, but we're going to pay you. We're going to pay you. Why? Listen to this. Mishum bali zroa shema yavoa v'yitlu mehen. Lefichach tiknu len chachamim sheyitlu schar min alishka kadei sheyifreshu akol me'osam akom. Both listen to this. But the Ram says for a totally different reason. We pay the guy. But do you know why we pay the guy? Because we'll say we're concerned that if it's an unpaid custodian, what's going to happen? Reuven's going to come along, and he's going to see Shimon. Shimon's standing, right? I'm standing there, watching over some wheat and some barley for the Beis HaMikdash. Reuven says, step aside. It's Shemitah. Everything is hefker. I said, I'm so sorry. I'm doing a favor for the Beis HaMikdash, and I'm watching the barley. Favor shmever, right? So if you're not employed by the Beis HaMikdash, you're just a guy. I'm just a guy. Very nice. I'm a concerned citizen. So therefore, I'm going to say this is incredible. However, if I'm paid by the Beis HaMikdash, then what? Then what? I'm an employee, right? I'm an employee, right? Here's my W-2 for the Beis HaMikdash, right? I'm getting paid. But once I'm on the payroll of the Beis HaMikdash, I'm an agent of the Beis HaMikdash. Once I'm an agent of the Beis HaMikdash, what is Reuven going to do? Walk away. Walk away. So this is pretty incredible. So I just want to point out something amazing. So the Rambam, right? The Rambam, it appears from the Rambam that halacha l'maisa, we do accept the premise of the Gemara, which is that privately held items can become the property, can become communal offerings. So that's why the Rambam is not, remember again, the Rambam is not concerned that if I'm unpaid, I'm going to acquire it for myself and then have a problem transferring it. It's not a problem to transfer it. Actually, the Rambam just says, we want the shomer to be paid so that other people take the shomer seriously. Pretty incredible. Good. Let's go weiter. That's the Rambam. The Gemara goes weiter. Hashomer shtei alechem lechem apanu kol karbanos tzibor. So we'll say taman taninon. We learned kol karbanos hayacher vat tzibor ba'in min haaretz o min hachutz laaretz min hachadash unesh. We'll say in general, any karbanos, be them individual karbanos, communal karbanos, can come from produce or from animals in Eretz Yisrael, outside of Eretz Yisrael, from Chadash, from Yashan. It doesn't really matter all that much, with two notable exceptions. Chutz mina omer shtei lechem. Both with the exception of Karban Omer, both say it's incredible. Both say this halacha l'maisa. Right, today is the third day of the Omer, Karban Omer, incredible, counting down to Shavuos shtei lechem. So with the exception of the Omer shtei lechem, shein boin ela min hachadash min haaretz. Both listen to this. Karban Omer and Karban shtei lechem must come from Chadash, new produce that's grown since last year, right? I should say this year's crop. Umina aretz, it has to come from Eretz Yisrael. Both say very interesting. You can't import barley for the Karban Omer, and you can't import wheat for the Shtei HaLechem. It must come from Eretz Yisrael. Rav Huna b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Ein HaOmer ba min Asuria. Both say, listen to this. This is really quite amazing. Rabbi Shmuel goes so far to say that the Omer can't even come from Syria. Now both say, now what's Syria? What's Syria? Essentially, pretty much modern-day Syria. But say, remember again, that was part of territorial Eretz Yisrael. David HaMelech conquered Syria. Syria is always interesting in the eyes of halacha because it has the status of kibush yachid, of an individual conquest. In other words, David HaMelech, there was that was a milchemes which shows that it was not an obligatory war, and David HaMelech did not have the full support of the people for that war. He was successful, but he didn't have the full support. So it's a whole discussion halacha in general about what the status of Syria is. So for certain things, it's considered like Eretz Yisrael. For other things, it's like chutz la'aretz. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Shmuel says that for the purposes of barley or wheat, for Omer or for Shtei HaLechem, we don't import wheat. We don't import grain from Syria for these things. Pretty incredible. Taman Tanina, Eser Kiddusha Hosein. Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say there are 10 levels of Kiddusha in this world. Eretz Yisrael Mikudeshes Mikol Ha'aratzos. We'll say so beautiful, right? Eretz Yisrael is the holiest land in this world. Right, the holiest land that exists on the earth is Eretz Yisrael. So what happens? Umay Kiddushasa. How does the Kiddusha of Eretz Yisrael manifest? How is the Kiddusha manifest? Because it will say for certain agricultural mitzvos like Omer, Shtei HaLechem, Bikurim, first fruits, they only come from Eretz Yisrael and from nowhere else. Rabbi Chia, B'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Ein Omer Ba Min Surya. Because also remember again, Rabbi Shmuel goes so far to say, not only does Omer not come from Chutz La'aretz, but what Rabbi say, it can't come from anywhere that's not what? That's not what? 1,000% Eretz Yisrael. So even if you have a suffix Eretz Yisrael, like Surya, you can say, by the way, you had, if you remember again, if you go back to the beginning of the first Mishnah in Gittin, remember again, you have certain areas that were mesupak about Eretz Yisrael. Even, for example, those machlokes about Akko, right? Is Akko Eretz Yisrael? Is Akko Chutz La'aretz? So again, Rabbi Shmuel would say now, obviously, Surya, Bosai, is even different than Akko, right? Because Akko, there's a shaila just like where the line. Surya, everyone is agreeing it's kibush yach. Okay, the Gemara goes right there. So Gemara says, Taman Tanina Rabbi Shmuel Omer Macharish Rishus Af Katzi Rishus. So we'll say the Gemara is talking over here about the pasuk by Shabbos, right? The Torah says Bacharish ubakatzir tishbos, right? Bacharish ubakatzir tishbos. You're not allowed to go ahead and, Shemitah. You're not allowed to go ahead and do charish and katzir. So the Gemara says macharish rishus af katzir rishus. Just as plowing is optional, so too again, what's prohibited Rabbosai on Shemitah? What's prohibited? Harvesting that is optional. Yotza katzir haomer shim mitzvah. This comes to exclude the katzir haomer, the cutting down of the omer. Ultimately, again, that is going to be a mitzvah. Rabbi Shmuel kedaite Rabbi Shmuel da omer ina omer ba min Surya kedaite da omer yotza katzir haomer shim mitzvah. Good. Man tana shomri sviches b'shvius noten schar mitruma salishka. So let's go back for just a moment. So we've established a couple of things. We've established again the fact that again omer shtei halechem as well as bikurim must come from Chadash and must come from Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, who is the opinion who says, Man tana shomei svichim b'shvius noten schar mitrumas halishka? So is the opinion who holds that halacha l'maisa, those who go ahead and watch the svichim, right, the growths during the Shemitah year, to keep them safe for the carbon omer shtei halechem, that they get paid from the lishka, from the withdrawal of the machzor shag. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosef divrei akoli. Rabbi Yosef says, no, it's everyone. Lo matzu b'surya mevi'in osa misvichin sheberetz Yisrael. So this is very interesting because this opinion says that ideally, if we don't find anything in Surya, we'll go ahead and we'll bring from the svichin in Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, so fine. So we'll say, so again, there happens to be a view that holds that halacha l'maisa, if you can't go, so there is an opinion that holds that you can bring in omer and shtei halechem from Surya. Right now, again, the Gemara rejects that opinion, but that opinion does exist. So listen to this interesting case. Hahin omer Moishe yizra betchila. Shabbos say this is a fascinating shaila. Take a look over here. Take a look. It's in the Tiklin Chadatin. In the last short line, Maul Yizra betchila kishein svichin imutar Yizra b'shvius b'Eretz Yisrael da k'tzira chutra b'shvius l'Torah chomer. Both listen to this. Here's the shaila. What happens if you have no svichin? Both remember again, svichin are aftergrowths, which are things that grow on their own. What happens if, for some reason, you have no? I'm calling it. I don't know if aftergrowths is the right English word, but you understand items that grow on their own. Both say the Gemara is asking a fascinating shaila. What happens if there's not going to be any wheat or barley growing for the carbon omer or shtei halechem? Can you plant wheat and barley on Shemitah for the purpose of what? For the purpose of the what? Of the carbon. You hear the shaila? Can you actively plant on Shemitah year, but for the purpose of the omer or shtei halechem? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chia bar Ada boy kumei Rabbi Mana. Lo nimtza kekomet al shirayim. Lo nimtza. I'm sorry. So Rabbi Chia bar Ada asked this kasha before Rabbi Mana, and they said, Lo nimtza kekomet al shirayim she'in nechalin. Both say, isn't this like a kometz without shirayim? So we'll say, so remember again, what's the halacha? Remember, if you have a carbon mincha, so the way a mincha works is, all the Kohen does is he takes a kmitza, right? The 3 middle fingers worth of flour, puts that on the mizbeach, and the rest is consumed. What happens if you have a carbon mincha where the shirayim was lost, the leftover part of the carbon was lost? To which the Gemara says, we still offer up the kmitza. Take a look at the Tiklin Chadatin for just a moment. He says, "Bekometz al shirayim," second wide line. To kometz she'in matir shirayav la'achila eino kometz V'hachinami yoshirayim asurim kishiyazrei b'shvius. So we'll say if you have a komet that is not matir shayim, right? A komet is only effective if there's something to be matir. But if there's nothing to be matir, the kamitza is not effective. So the Gemara wants to suggest that wouldn't that be the same thing with planting grain on Shemitah? To which the Gemara says, no, rather it becomes like 5 things which are brought in a state of tumah, even though you cannot consume them in tumah. But if you take a look at the Tziril Chadatin again, he says, "Tistam b'psachim va'omer be'zalechem michshav sham v'asam v'ada inshay nechalim." We'll say there's interestingly enough, there are certain things which are brought in a state of tumah, even though they can't be consumed. Which I will say is an interesting case, because what it's saying is there are certain things that are so essential that even if you have to bring them in a compromised fashion, you do so. Which would seem to indicate that if you have no wheat and no barley, no svichin in a Shemitah year, that perhaps we would even allow you to plant during the Shemitah year in order to be able to harvest and bring the carbon. Even though, again, what you're doing is aser. So the Gemara says, Amrlei, so what do you do? So we'll say, what do you do? So now, both the Gemara is transitioning for just a moment. The Gemara is going back. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, the Gemara doesn't seem to answer that particular question. In other words, what do you do if there are no sfichin? Do you go ahead and actively plant barley and grain during the Shemitah year? So we'll say the Gemara doesn't resolve that particular shaila. Although it sounds like ultimately, again, you would do it. The Gemara is comparing it to a case of 5 things that are brought in a state of tumah, even though you can't consume them. But the Gemara does not rule conclusively on that issue. Keitziro, so we'll say the Gemara just says, by the way, now how do we pay the shomer? So if you look at the Tziril Chadatin, he says, Keitziro osa amas Nisan lehadr leferushe keitzad porin l'shomer svichin demilishka yav shalot zektish shulchan aruch. So interestingly enough, how do you? So remember, going with the approach, we saw the Rambam even paskin. The Mishnah said, not like Rabbi Yossi, like the Tanakama, which means that we're going to appoint a shomer. We're going to appoint a guy to go ahead and watch over the growths, right? Watch over the grain and the barley that's growing during Shemitah, to keep guard of it so we could use it for Shtei Alechem and for the Omer. Good. So we'll say, so now the shaila is, how do we pay him? Now, both you'll say to yourself, how do you pay him? That's easy. How do you pay him? How do you pay him? You give him money. We just said, right? After all, isn't that the topic of the Mishnah? We withdraw the money, and with it we go ahead and we pay the guy. I'll say, here's the problem. You can't just simply take money that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash and pay it to an individual for chulin work. In other words, we'll say, although the work that he's doing is the Lord's work, right? He's watching over the wheat and barley. Lemaisa, again, that still would be considered to be a chulin payment. So there has to be some process of deconsecration of funds before it gets into the pocket of the shomer. So how do you do it? Keitzidu osa, no tel ma'os min hashulchani, v'nostin l'kosun. So we'll say we take money from the money changer. So we'll say, so essentially what we do is the first set of funds we take from chulin funds. They're money changer funds. V'nostin l'kosun, the shomer, ad shlo yikrav ha'omer. And we go ahead and we pay the people who harvest the grain, the people, because also remember again, there's whole support staff in getting the grain ready. So you have to pay the guy who harvests the grain. You want to go out and watch the guy who's watching the grain. Actually, yukrav ha'omer, umevi ma'os mitrumas halishka, umechalalin alov. So we'll say, so what do? We go ahead and we pay, we want to pay the workers up front. So essentially what you do is you get in advance from the money changers, use the money from the money changers to pay the workers, and then ultimately, again, once the Omer is harvested, or the Shtei Lechem is harvested, we deconsecrate, right? We transfer the sanctity of the funds onto what? Onto the wheat, or onto the grain. So the grain is sanctified, and the money becomes deconsecrated. So we'll say, very interesting. First of all, just also an interesting yisod. As well, say, so why not just wait to pay the guys? What's the answer? You don't wait to pay your workers, right? Pay them. You want to pay the workers. So ultimately, again, we get an advance on the funds. So right, the payment funds come from the shulchani, right? They come from the money changers. Pay the workers. Then once the grain is harvested, deconsecrate the money, right? Take the consecration of the money, transfer it onto the Omer. Now the money is deconsecrated. You can then go back and pay back the money changers. Or maybe trumas alishka or mechalin alav. V'tavos came. So is this a good approach? Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba So Gemara says, yes, it works, because at the end of the day, the Gemara says, isn't this problematic? Because aren't you then effectively using temple funds, kind of in an indirect fashion to not really pay for temple services? To which the Gemara essentially says, no, since we know how this process is going to work from the beginning, it's ki'ilu, the temple funds are ultimately paying the workers. We're just doing a little bit of a workaround over here because we want to pay the workers quickly. So Tana Apa Pischa Avanim Kain, this is the same process applied by the stone workers, the masons, who work for the Beis Hamikdash. Ketzur Osa no Tomas Mishulchan Vinosin Lechotzvin Levila Sasasin Ad Shelo Tinosin Agabe Adimos. So we go ahead and once again, we get the money, right? We get the advance. I will say the money changers are effectively the bank, right? They're the bank. We get the advance from the bank, pay the workers from the bank, even before we go, the workers finish putting the top row of stones on whatever it is that they're building. O Mishanitin Aladimos, maybe most Mitrumas Alishka. Once they go ahead and they finish putting the top row of stones, we bring money out of the temple treasury. Mechalolin aleh, we transfer the sanctity of the money onto the stones. Vitavos kain, and this process works, or does this process work? It's a question. Rabbi Yossi ki be'rebon b'shem Shmuel komashi yitain hein damem b'sharishon. Yes, because it will say it's understood that ultimately, again, retroactively, the monies that were dispensed were the very monies that were set aside from the beginning. So we'll say, so even though this is just a little bit of a cleaner way of ensuring, first of all, that the workers get paid earlier, and also, again, it's just easier because this allows us to directly deconsecrate temple funds onto something actively consecrated. So we're able to deconsecrate the funds onto the barley and onto the wheat. We're able to deconsecrate the funds onto the stones. That way, again, there's a direct transference of sanctity from the money in the Beis HaMikdash to an object which belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, as opposed to deconsecrating it in a way that goes into someone's pocket. So say everything works, but Allah Lamaisa, the money is deconsecrated in a little bit of a superior fashion. Beautiful. Amid Bezer will say, Mishnah. These are great sugyas. Para will say more things that are bought with the funds. More things brought with the funds. Mishnah. Para. Visar Mishnah Leach Velashon Sal Zahoris. Para Aduma will say is great. Will say just it's so interesting because we know from the beginning of the Masechta that what do you do with the matzah shayla that's collected? What do you do with it? What do you do with it? Karbanos sivar, right? Communal offerings. So we'll say, I think when we think about communal offerings, often what goes through our mind is what? Tamid shel shachar, tamid shel ben arbayim. There's a morning communal offering, afternoon communal. But now it's very exciting because the Mishnayos are going through all of these different things that are brought with this money. Including, I will say, support salaries, which is quite interesting. So, para aduma, se'ira mishtalech. I will say again, this is the goat that's sent into the wilderness on Yom Kippur. Lasson shel zahoris, the red wool. I will say now we're going to see red wool was used in 3 different services. Bo'in mitrumas halishka. All of these things come from the Machzis HaShekel collection, right? Trumas halishka means a withdrawal from the temple treasury. Listen to this. Kevesh para, the kevesh sher mishtaleach. So let's listen to this. What about the ramp of the para? The Rebbe say this is very interesting. Remember, the para aduma was taken to Har HaZeisim. It was slaughtered, not in the Beis HaMikdash. It was slaughtered right at Har HaZeisim, opposite the Beis HaMikdash. They would construct a special ramp to transport the par from the Beis HaMikdash to Har HaZeisim. Because remember, again, essentially, you don't want anything happening to that par. So they constructed a special ramp to get it from point A to point B. Similar idea, the Kavesh Sir Mishtaleach. When they went ahead, this is actually Mishnah Yuma, when they went ahead and they transported the seir, the goat that was going to be pushed off the cliff, from the Beis HaMikdash to the outskirts of the city, they also built a special ramp to get it out. Velashon Shabin Karnov, and again, the red wool that was tied around the horns of the Sira Mishtaleach, Va'amas Hamayim, and the channel of water. So we spoke about this in Pesachim, right? The channel of water that went through the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, the Chomos Ha'ir, and the walls of the city of Yerushalayim, Umigdalosel, and the towers of the city, the Chol Tzarechei Ha'ir, and all of the needs of Yerushalayim, the city, the municipality, Mishayare Halishka. All of these came, Rabbi say, from the leftover shkalim. Mishiyare halishka. Mishiyare halishka. If you take a look, we'll see what it is. So Mishiyare halishka. So the Gemara says, Abba Shal Omer, Kevesh para hakohanim gidolim osin. Misha atzmon. Ram for the paraduma. Actually, that was made by the Kohanim themselves. Kohanim Gidolim. I will say, is interesting notion. Kohanim, who are the Kohanim Gidolim plural? So we'll say, first of all, remember again, you always had a Kohen Gadol and what? And a Skan Kohen Gadol. But remember, also, you also had retired Kohanim Gidolim. Right? You could have a Kohen Gadol who would retire. So you could have a Kohen Gadol emeritus. Right? So the idea, now again, they didn't have any function. They were Kohanim. But the idea is that ramp for the Paraduma that was funded by the Kohanim Gidolim. The Kohanim Gidolim Benevolent Association, right? They went ahead and, so the Gemara says, Misha Atzman, right? Misha Atzman, Mosa Shari Lishkamaha Osiman. Both say, so what did they do with any leftover funds? So both say, so after you took care of all of the needs of the Beis HaMikdash, what happens if there were leftover funds? What would you do with them? So Maya Osiman, Lochin Bahem Yenos Ushmana Besalsos. So the Beis HaMikdash would purchase wine and oil and fine flour. And they would sell it. And they would sell it for a profit. So we'll say essentially they would get into commodities, right? They would sell oil, flour, wine, and they would sell it to people. Who would they sell it to? Remember again, anyone who was coming to the Beis HaMikdash often had to purchase these items. So you would purchase it at the Beis HaMikdash from the Beis Midrash, probably at a premium, but that was okay because remember again, part of your purchase price was tax deductible because it was a donation, right? So they would make money like this. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva Omer, no, ein mishtakrin. I shouldn't say mishtakrin. Mistakrin, ein mistakrin b'shal hagdish. Well, see, this is actually quite interesting. We don't do business with communal funds. Others will say, because it's a very dangerous business to get into. What happens if the Beis HaMikdash starts selling wine, oil, and flour, and then what happens? Let's say, both say, Baruch Hashem, there's an overabundance of these items, which then means what happens? Prices go down. That means they're gonna take a loss. So this is incredible. Rabbi Akiva says, we do not start doing business with communal funds. That is a bad idea. So the Gemara says. Furthermore, Rabbi Akiva says, Af lo mishal aniyim. Furthermore, we don't do business with tzedakah funds. I will say this is a big shaila in halacha. Let's say you have a tzedakah fund, and let's say you happen to have some money in your tzedakah fund, and now you figure, you know what? Let me invest it. Make a little bit of money. I will say, are you permitted to go ahead and invest tzedakah funds? I will say, by the way, this is let's say one has their own charity account. Right, a person has a charity. I separate out myself from my earnings. I have a charity account. Like truth is, on an individual level, it's not as much of a shaila because the truth is, you could do whatever you want for your charity account as long as you know that what you're on the hook for it. So if you want to go and invest your Meiser account, that's fine. But whatever it is, you're mechuyev to dispense that. So if you take a loss on your investment, the shaila is more in the realm of communal funds. Right? In the realm of communal funds, are you allowed to develop or to devise an investment strategy for communal funds right now? Or do we say, Rabbi Akiva says, no, we don't invest communal funds. Or at least we don't invest communal funds in anything that has any element of risk. I guess if you want to buy a treasury bond, right? You want to buy something that has a guaranteed yield, that's fine, you could do that. But lamaisa, you can't do anything that has any level of risk associated with it. So the Gemara says, Moser at Truma. So we'll say, so again, what about halacha lamaisa? So we'll say, after they took all of the above mentioned items, so after they paid for all of the communal items, so if there's money left over, mahayu osinba, what would they do with it? So the Gemara says, Rekui zov tzipay base kodesh chadashim. So we'll say they would use the leftover funds. Often the interior of the kodesh HaKadoshim, the walls were gold plated. Well, over time, the plating had to be replaced. So they would replace the plating from that money, from that leftover money. Rabbi Shmuel Omer Moser Peiros Kesem Mizbeach. Rabbi Shmuel says the leftover of the Peiros, and the Gemara will see what that phrase means. Kesem Mizbeach was dessert for the Mizbeach. Again, I will say we'll see what that means as well. Moser Truma, the leftover of the Truma L'Kli Sharis. And Rabbi say we'll define all of these things in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Moser Truma l'Keitzam Mizbeach, the leftover of the Truma. Moser Keitzam Mizbeach, we're going to see literally means dessert for the Mizbeach, which meant offerings that were offered up on the Mizbeach. Moser Nisachim Likli Sharis, the leftover of the Nisachim and for Kli Sharis. So we'll say again, we're going to define all of these terms in the Gemara. Rabbi Hananya Skana Kohanim Omer, Rabbi Hananya the Skana Kohanim said, Moser Nisachim Ketzam Mizbeach, the leftover of the Nisachim. In other words, we'll say this, Bepashtos, this means if you had leftover monies that were meant for Nisachim, libations, what do you do with it? You use it for karbanos. Moserat truma likli sharis. If there's any leftover from the truma, that ultimately goes for service utensils. Ze v'zelo hayu modim beperos. But neither of them, again, I will say, were used by peros. Again, we're going to define what that peros case is. It's not clear from the Mishnah. We'll see that in the Gemara. It says the Gemara, kevesh para. So we'll say, remember again, they made a ramp for the paraduma. So there was a machlokes, we'll say, about who paid for the ramp for the paraduma. First opinion said that came from Machzas HaShekel. Second opinion said who paid for it? Who paid for it? The Kohanim Gedolim. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, b'shem Rabbi Yonasan, Gimel Lashonos hein shells, Gimel Lashonos hein. Both say red wool was used in three different contexts. Shel seir besela. So we'll say ultimately again the red wool that was used by the seir hamishtalech. That's the goat of Yom Kippur. That wool was a sela in weight. But say here they're referring to weight. It had a weight of 1 sela. Shal mitzora b'shekel, the mitzora red wool was a weight of a shekel. Shal para b'shtei slaim, ultimately again of a para aduma, the red wool was 2 slaim. I will say, interestingly enough, the red wool of the para aduma, remember again, it was mixed in with the water and everything, so that was the heaviest wool because it had to sink to the bottom of the water. Rabbi Chunya dibras chavrin, Rabbi Ba bar Zavda b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, shal para b'shtei slaim umechza. The weight of the wool of the para aduma was 2.5 slaim. The is the mafkin lishna ba'asara zuz. And others say ultimately again that it had a weight of 10 zuz. Good. Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Shmuel Talmidi Chachamim Lamden Esakarim Hilchos Shchita, Hilchos Kabbalah, Hilchos Riga, Notlin Schar Mitrumas Shka. Both another fascinating case. Remember, Kohanim had to be trained, right? They had to be trained in Shchita, how do you shecht? They had to be trained in how do you do Kabbalah, receive the blood. They had to be trained in Zrika. Then I both say, I want to show you something fascinating. Lav dafka that the Rebbeim who taught these skills were Kohanim. I was about to say, you could have a Talmud Chacham who's very skilled, certainly in Shechita, but even in Kabbalah and Zrika, they learned the sugyas. So there were staff, they were Rebbeim who were employed by the Beis HaMikdash to teach the Kohanim how to do Shechita, how to do Kabbalah, how to do Zrika, noten schar mitrumas alishka. So Abu say their salaries were paid from the leftover machzas hashekel. So we'll say, so again, I just want to point out, this was after you paid for all of the communal sacrifices, right? And all these items mentioned in the Mishnah, leftover monies were ultimately used to pay salaries of the teachers of the Kohanim. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Redifa, b'shem Rabbi Imi, mevakri mumei kachim, noten schar mitrumas alishka. Furthermore, again, I will say, mum inspectors. Remember again, I will say, mum inspectors, people who examined animals for disqualifying blemishes, also didn't have to be Kohanim. They're also paid from the temple treasury. Rabbi Acha, Rabbi Tanchum, Rabbi Chia, B'shem Rabbi Smaloi, Magi Sefer HaZara, Notlin Scharan Mitrumas Alishka. But listen to this. They had a Sefer Torah that remained in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. So it's actually Girsav is if it's Sefer HaZara or Sefer Ezra, right? But the idea is they had a Sefer Torah which was considered to be the most authoritative Sefer Torah in Klal Yisrael. So obviously that Sefer Torah needed some upkeep as well. So the wage paid to those who helped with upkeep ultimately came from temple treasury as well. Gidul bar Binyamin b'shem Rabbi Asi, Shnei Dayanik Gzelos, Notlin Schara Mitrumas Alishkan. We'll say there are 2 primary judges in Yerushalayim, ultimately again, who were in charge of monetary law. Their salaries came from the Trumas Alishka. Shmuel Amar, Nashima Argos Beparochas, Notlin Scharan Mitrumas Alishka. So Shmuel says the women who weave the parochas, we'll say the parochas refers to the curtain in the Beis HaMikdash itself between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Those women get their money from Trumas Alishka. So remember again, this all refers to the leftover Shekalim. Rabbi Chuma Omer, Mitrumas Bedek Habayis. Rabbi Chuna says, no, they don't get paid from the Trumas Halishka, the leftover Machzis HaShekel. They get paid from the temple upkeep fund, from Bedek Habayis. Different account. I will say, so what's the nafkamina? Mapligi, Shmuel Avadlaka Karban, Rav Huna Avadlaka Binyan. But this is fascinating. The machlokes was, how do you view the curtains? Were the curtains viewed like a carbon, right? Or were the curtains viewed like a building? Right? Was it capital improvements or was it sacrifices? So we'll say this was an accounting issue. They're getting paid, right? The good news is they're getting paid. But a fascinating internal accounting. We're supposed to remember again, it's incredibly important to know what's coming from which fund, because I will say again, it's all about financial transparency. What fund? And there was an audit. We'll see. There was a Beis Midrash audit. So what fund are the women getting paid from? Is the curtain like a carbon? So it's coming from Shumas Halishka, from the Machzis HaShekel, or is it like capital improvements, like building fund, and it's coming from the Kabayis? Reb Chizkiah, Tan Rabbi Huda. Good gogos hakitores v'chol karbanos hatzibor b'amid shumas halishkan. So the kitores and any communal offerings, so we'll say, of course, it's coming from shumas halishka, from the Machzis HaShekel. Mizbeach hazav v'chol kli sharis bo'in mimosar nesachim. Interesting enough, I will say, the Mizbeach hazav, the golden altar, and any of the service utensils came from any of the leftover funds from libations. Mizbeach ha'olah v'heichal v'azaras. Ultimately, again, the Mizbeach ha'olah, which was the large animal altar, animals, right? The large Mizbeach, and the heichal, improvement to the heichal structure, or the azaras to the courtyards. Ba'in mishiyare halishka. Ultimately, again, that came ultimately from the leftover Machzis HaShekel as well. Chutz la'azaras ba'in milishkas bedek habayis. Anything outside of the azaras came from the Bedek Habayis, the Temple Improvement Fund. V'utani avnei hamizbeach heichal v'azaros mo'alin bahen. And ultimately, we learned that the stones of the Mizbeach, the heichal and the azaros, are subject to Me'ilah. But one second, v'chi yesh Me'ilah b'shrayim. But also, you just said before that these are paid for from leftover Machzis HaShekel. Is there any Me'ilah associated with the Machzis HaShekel? Because Rameir ultimately says that Allah Lamaisa, the leftover Machzis HaShekel, is in fact subject to Me'ilah. Oh, I'm sorry, the Shiraim, the leftover Machzis HaShekel, is subject to Me'ilah. Ultimately, again, Rabbi say yet, Rabbi Meir even held that was only within the year. But after the year, ultimately, again, we learned that Allah Lamaisa, after the year, can't be from Shirayim. Reb Chizkiah, Tanur, so we'll say, to stop over. We'll pick up Reb Chizkiah tomorrow. We'll say, again, continuing now on the theme, you begin to see now it becomes a little bit interesting, because Reb say, well, it's always been interesting, but you begin to see again, so remember, karbanos, and salaries directly associated from karbanos are going to come from the Machzis HaShekel. Interestingly enough, kind of once you branch out a little bit, now there's a whole discussion, what's coming from which fund. All of it is necessary, all of it is needed, but what's going to come from Machzis HaShekel? What's going to come from Bedek Habayis? So that's going to be a little bit of a subject of discussion in Beis Hashem continuing tomorrow. Shkar Chabosai.
For the Torah makes perfect sense. I think a Jewish mother's never going to say,
That's right. My son, the Kohen Gadol.